Welcome to the February 21st, 2018 edition of FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live. I'm Dan Barker.
I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, and Dan and I are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Thank you for watching.
I'm Andrew Seidel, a constitutional attorney and FFRF's Director of Strategic Response.
And today we are going to comment on the subject of the national debate after last week's horrific shooting of 14 students and 3 teachers at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. The whole debate about thoughts and prayers.
Specifically, we'll be talking about the futility of thoughts and prayers and the welcome rebellion among many students, members of the media, and others against this mindless political response to school shootings and other mass shootings.
If you're watching this show live, you can send in your thoughts and your non-prayers, your comments or your questions to air on this program. Please comment below on Facebook, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
And I think it is time for a secular hallelujah, that there is now this uprising against the political platitude of thoughts and prayers. Journalists, families of victims and survivors, especially those admirable high school survivors, are calling out self-righteous public officials who wrap themselves in piety as if that were an excuse for taking no action.
As New York Times columnist Timothy Egan put it, stuff the thoughts, hold the prayers, and do something.
Let's look at some of the national pushback against this idea of thoughts and prayers, including this brilliant action by Fern Malila of Michigan. She wrote her member of Congress, "Dear Representative Bergman, since you and your colleagues in Congress seem to feel that this is the solution to mass murder, please accept this contribution." And as you can see, she posted a photo of her check with her campaign contribution on her Facebook page, and on the check the amount was filled in as thoughts and prayers.
Well-known personalities are chiming in, such as actress Elizabeth Banks, and you can see that she crossed out thoughts and prayers and she wrote public policy and change.
The actor Mark Ruffalo tweeted, "Prayers without accordant action are silent lies told to oneself, heard by no God, amounting to nothing."
And the famous writer Stephen King predicted after the shooting, "There will be prayers from Blabbermouth Don, Pence the Grinch, and their right-wing cohorts. But there will be no call for any sort of sane gun regulations."
And hey, I don't follow Kim Kardashian normally. I don't know her views on religion overall, but I sure loved her tweet on the day of the Florida school shooting. That was Valentine's Day, in which she said, "We owe it to our children and our teachers to keep them safe while at school. Prayers won't do this, action will."
And there are plenty of others pushing back against the thoughts and prayers cliche. A writer for Jimmy Kimmel Live tweeted the amount of contributions prayerful lawmakers are getting from the NRA. The NRA and its affiliates spent a record $54 million during the 2016 election, including $30.3 million to help elect Donald Trump.
And right on cue, here was Trump's tweet right after the shooting, "My prayers and condolences, blah, blah, blah." But even Trump has caved in a bit to this intense pressure, and that pressure includes tweets from angry students that we won't read out loud. That pressure includes the dramatic school walkouts all over the country, including students from the school busing to Tallahassee to beg for the repeal, for the banning of assault weapons in our country. So he yesterday announced that he wanted to do something about those so-called bump stocks that convert semi-automatic guns into automatic weapons. Of course, he had refused to act on that after the massacre in Las Vegas.
Florida Senator Marco Rubio, a recipient of NRA largesse, tweeted, "Today is that terrible day you pray never comes." I went after him myself on Twitter, writing that it's almost like prayers are ineffective, especially when people with power and a responsibility to do something would rather take millions of dollars from the NRA and say a prayer than protect America's children. And of course, Rubio's statement unintentionally confirms FFRF's motto that nothing fails like prayer.
The New York Times put up an amazing chart. Thoughts and Prayers and NRA Funding was the title of that chart, following the Las Vegas shooting last fall, contrasting the politicians' thoughts and prayer statements side by side with NRA expenditures on their behalf. The gun group has spent more than $3 million on Marco Rubio, as Andrew just pointed out.
And then there's those evangelists, and I was very disgusted by the tweet by the National Day of Prayer Task Force, not my favorite task force, and that's the group that has essentially hijacked what is already the unconstitutional National Day of Prayer and turned it into an evangelical theocratic spectacle. And the task force tweeted, America must call on the Lord for the victims of families. And the tweet said, every American must call on God at this time. And my rejoinder would be to say that the Lord has been AWOL at all of the school shootings. And there have already been 7 school shootings this year, and that doesn't include the kids who take a gun and commit suicide on campus.
And you've probably heard the news that Billy Graham has died. FFRF put up a statement about that on our website. Billy long ago passed the baton to his son, Franklin Graham, who retweeted Trump's vacuous remark and then added his own. Graham said, "Pray for those affected by the shooting." Then he had the audacity to later tweet, "As a nation, we've become desensitized to the value of human life." And of course, he was complaining about legal abortion. And he warned that my prayer is that America will wake up before it's too late. God's judgment is coming.
And so I love this news story actually this morning about a student who said, quit worrying about the unborn children, worry about the children who are born, we're afraid to go to school.
Yeah, and of course, there's been a lot of pushback. I mean, here's a photo of a literal delivery of thoughts and prayers to President Trump by a true believer. This is actually a member of Congress desperately trying to give substance to insubstantial prayers. Illinois, I think this is one of your congressmen.
Those were like prayers written on paper?
Prayers written on paper.
Yeah, at first I thought it was a parody.
Well, for a little comic relief, let's take a look at some cartoonists who are puncturing the pious hypocrisy of sending only thoughts and prayers.
Thought, prayer, first aid.
Band-aids.
Band-aids. I love this one. There's all these buttons, do something, do something, do something, and then he's pressing thoughts and prayers. And here's the politician saying, is it safe to come out yet? Yeah, they're praying.
They're hiding underneath thoughts and prayers.
A little comic relief is welcome.
So we're going to have comments.
Yeah, but before we go to your comments and questions, we do have a couple of other comments. I wanted to know whether you guys know and whether the public knows that the school in Florida where the shooting happened is named for a freethinker, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And she's one of the greatest environmental writers and activists of the 20th century. She wrote the groundbreaking book, The Everglades, River of Grass, in 1947. It forever changed the way we look at wetlands, and it was an instant bestseller and a battle anthem for preservationists. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas spent the rest of her life advocating for the Everglades.
And although she grew up in a religious household, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called herself an agnostic. In her 1987 autobiography, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote, it's called The Voice of the River. She wrote that she did not believe in the existence of a soul. "I think death is the end," she said. "A lot of people can't bear that idea, but I find it a little restful, really." She died at age 108 in 1998, earning that rest, asking for no religious ceremony at her funeral.
And we applaud the students, teachers, parents, and others around the nation preparing to march for their lives next month in D.C. on March 24th, 2018. And there will be satellite marches on the same day popping up all around the globe.
Now, let's take a look at your thoughts, but not your prayers, your comments and questions on this issue of hiding behind religion and prayer instead of taking real action. Not just on this issue, but on public officials creating prayer treating prayer as if it's a bona fide social policy or action. Do we have some thoughts?
We do have a few, and we actually have one on just kind of a general query about Billy Graham.
That's fine.
And I was actually writing the statement for FFRF this morning, and I learned an interesting fact that he was caught on tape with Nixon, both on the phone and in the Oval Office, saying quite a few anti-Semitic things. And one of those tapes is actually from the morning of the 1972 National Prayer Breakfast. They were in the Oval Office trading anti-Semitic barbs right after the National Prayer Breakfast.
And he wasn't behind the National Prayer Breakfast per se, but he was the one who suggested the National Day of Prayer in 1952, and Congress immediately took him up on it and passed this unconstitutional law, which of course FFRF had famously sued over and won at the first level before we got thrown out on standing. And it's been a very insidious law. But what does the comment say about Graham?
Well, we're gonna be working for a long time to undo his legacy.
Yes.
It was just what were our thoughts about Graham.
Oh,
But also,
let's talk a little bit more about him, though.
Sure.
Because, and you're too young probably to remember, he used to have columns, and maybe some of them were being published in other places around the country that I don't know about right up till now, where he would give advice. And boy, our members have been complaining about him for years because his advice about atheists was horrible. It was like treating us like we were lepers. I mean, he has going to get a lot of nice obituaries, but when it came to his effect on tolerance, social policy, anti-Semitism, and also pro-war, he had the ear to all the presidents, egging them on a Vietnam War, every war. He never found a war he didn't like.
well, very nationalistic. Besides the anti-Semitism remarks, his early rallies were racially segregated up into the 50s until that had to change. So, he was brought into prominence by right-wing conservative political people who saw him as this anti-Russian, anti-Red Scare, pro-American politician type of a preacher. And when you look at his life, what did he actually do for America? What did Billy Graham actually do besides thoughts and prayers?
Well, he entangled a lot of religion and government in his soul winning.
Yeah, so he made a lot of bad policy. He was on Capitol Hill in the beginning there in the 1950s arguing for prayer in Congress and for the days of the Bible and for all of these bad things that happened during that time.
Yeah. He rode that wave in the 1950s when Under God came into the pledge, when we got In God We Trust as the national motto. He was really a big part of that.
Well, I don't know if he rode the wave. I think he was creating the wave.
Pushing the wave.
He was a big influence of that.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate that question.
We'll be fighting his legacy for a long time.
Yes.
So Jim Mosser says, so no one prayed that those children weren't to be safe before now. What were the religious doing before now? I think what Jim is trying to say there is he agrees that the prayers have been ineffective up to this point. I mean, people pray after every single mass shooting, every single school shooting.
And before it.
Before it.
Before it, they're praying. They send their kids to school, dear God, protect my child today. And Florida had a big National Day of Prayer this year where they prayed for God's protection. They're going to be doing it in a few weeks again. Dear God, protect us. And look what happened. A hurricane hit, and then these shootings hit. So they've been praying, they've been asking, just like on 9/11, people were praying for God's protection. What good were those prayers?
And I would also have to say, FFRF doesn't have a policy per se on gun control, but I do as an individual. And the day of the shooting, I was watching Anderson Cooper because FFRF has been running our Ron Reagan commercials on certain days of the week, and I was watching, and he invited a teacher to be on, and she was still, of course, in shock. And she pointed out that they had a live shooting drill. They had drilled these kids to death. The teachers had all been drilled. Even these drills don't work. I mean, it's not just prayer. It's these ineffective, Band-Aid solutions to a national crisis with assault weapons out there.
There was just a local story on the news last night about a kid in a shop class here in Wisconsin, in a public school shop class, who invented a door jam, J-A-M, to actually jam the door handle up so that when a school shooter is rampaging through the school, they can't open the door at all. So it's much more sturdy than actually locking the door. And he sold 90 of them to his school. So we have kids out there inventing ways to prevent themselves from getting
Right,
murdered.
and I mean, all this terror, and the chances of any one student being harmed are very low, but yet it could happen anywhere.
And we actually have a question that ties in with something you said. Says, I know FFRF is an atheist, free thought, state church separation organization, but does FFRF have an official stance on the Second Amendment? That was asked by Steve M.
We don't have an official stance on the Second Amendment, but you and Sam Grover wrote a very interesting blog about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the Second Amendment was not understood the way it is now. It has not been understood that way in the past, and that's really not the way it's written if you look at the language.
Well, it talks about a militia.
A well-regulated militia.
Which is kind of like the, what do you call it? The National Reserve.
Yeah. But the point being that there was an active push by interest groups to redefine what the Second Amendment meant over the last 3 decades. And we were looking at that as sort of a case study because we're seeing that same push to redefine the religion clauses of the First Amendment right now to make the right to freely exercise your religion a right to impose that religion on other people. And we saw the first real big victory in that was the Hobby Lobby case in 2014, which was based on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But now we have the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which the Supreme Court's going to decide shortly, which is actually based on the First Amendment. So if that case goes the way we fear, that could be the kind of case that redefines the First Amendment.
So there's a parallel shifting in both of those amendments that's happening right now.
Yeah, it's a deliberate attempt by interest groups to redefine what the amendment means.
Many of our members are responsible gun owners, and my dad was a police officer, and he was a responsible gun owner.
But he never once shot, and he was very proud of that.
Well, he shot for practice. I mean,
he never had to use, and he drew his weapon only once. Is that right?
In 22 years as a police officer, he had it out of his holster just once and didn't fire it.
His father was very gentle guy.
So it's the Second Amendment has its value, of course, and gun ownership is a right that we all could have, but it's the responsible part of it. And with responsibility, some regulation would fall under that whole idea of responsibility.
But also, I have to quote Amit Paul, our director of communications, yesterday. He wasn't really joking when he said, "Gee, the writers of the Second Amendment could have done with a little more editing because the commas are in the wrong place." And I think that our nation, I'm going to speak for myself, not for FFRF, has to take a look at what the current interpretation of the Second Amendment is bringing down on our country. No other country is like this. We're number one in all of the gun shootings. No other countries are dealing with this. And why would anybody need to own an assault weapon? I don't think that the Second Amendment calls for that. That would be my personal opinion. I don't think that would be a violation of our Constitution at all. And I think I almost want to cry reading about these students. 100 students go to a funeral yesterday from that school at 7 a.m. and then they board a bus, and think of the organization that they had with their getting on a bus and driving and being driven 4 hours to Tallahassee. And before they get there, they find out that the legislators won't even vote on, they've already killed the issue, and and then they had to go back. I mean, and their classmates, they're just burying their classmates. These politicians don't care about anything but money.
Something has to be done, exactly.
So we have another question from Mark Hargrave. He says, my favorite argument has been, quote, well, this happened because God was kicked out of the schools. I guess God was not in those churches that were shot up, he points out. And actually, the T-shirt that we were going to show earlier was an example of this argument, writ large. The idea is, well, God was kicked out of the public schools, and then God responds by saying, yeah, that's why I can't help you kids out when there's a gunman rampaging through your halls because I'm not allowed in the public schools.
Yeah, well, God's AWOL when it comes to safety here.
So if that student with the guns had walked into the school and had seen the Ten Commandments on the wall, he might have said, oh, I shouldn't be killing. That's their idea, is that if we take the Ten Commandments or prayer or in God we trust out of the school, then students have no moral restrictions.
Yeah, I hate this argument for so many reasons, not the least of which is because there have been plenty of church shootings. But it also,
also religious students doing shootings.
But it also deliberately misconstrues what the law says. Kids can pray in school if they want. Kids can bring their Bible to school. They can have religious clubs. The school can't impose religion on the kids, which guarantees their free exercise.
And the
of
kids
religion.
can't impose through the auspices of the official school religion on other
others.
kids.
Exactly,
Like
exactly. So I mean,
loudspeaker prayers.
the idea that you can kick an omnipotent being out of anywhere who's also omnipresent anyway. I mean, it's an absurd T-shirt.
Well, and the idea that prayer is only effective if it happens inside that physical building during school hours. The prayers of the parents before they send the kids to school are worthless. That shows how impotent this omnipotent God is.
So we have a follow-up kind of question to that D. Hamilton asked, which is, what would you say to those that want Jesus back into our schools?
Well,
First Amendment.
And Jesus wasn't in at least half of the schools at the time that we were getting prayers out in the 60s. This was in many ways a comparatively recent development starting in the 50s again, where about half the schools were doing some kind of prayer. They weren't necessarily doing prayer to Jesus. And here in Wisconsin, as you two know, we have a very famous case from the 1890s where our Wisconsin State Supreme Court kicked Bibles out of schools in the 1890s, and it was a case brought by Catholics, because most of that early litigation was brought by Catholics who were a minority because the Protestant Bible was being used in the schools. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a myth, that we're not a theocracy, and our public schools weren't acting as if we were a theocracy. It's only this shift in the 70s and on where we've had such a takeover in so many ways by the religious right, the Christian right of our society, and that people are swallowing this idea that we've always been this religious.
Well, go ahead, Dan.
Asking that question, what would Jesus do if Jesus were here, is kind of pointless, because you can make the New Testament say almost anything you want. Jesus could be this or it could be that. There are even some feminists who say Jesus was the first feminist and the first pacifist, but
are any gay people saying Jesus was the first gay?
Well, he hung out with guys,
Maybe. Probably.
And Jonathan was the disciple that Jesus loved. I mean, you could find anything you want to in there. And even if Jesus did exist, and even if he could come back to the public schools, it's very clear that he said, when you pray, go into your closet and pray. Don't be like the hypocrites did want to be seen publicly praying. At least if he existed and said that would be one teaching they should take to heart.
And the teaching from the New Testament, render unto Caesar the things of Caesar, render unto the things of God to God. So even they're creating a separation.
So what about, I think you're right too. It was in Matthew 10:34 where he says, I've come to bring the sword?
Yeah, the family, you have to hate your family and bring... Yeah, he talked about weapons, and he even told his disciples, if you don't have a sword, sell your garment and go buy a sword. Yeah. So he was very militaristic.
All these naked warriors wandering around.
Well, it was just their outer garment, but still, because garments were a mode of exchange. A garment was like a bartering tool. But there's all sorts of other teachings of Jesus. Jesus said, you should be compassionate toward your slaves who did wrong but didn't know that they were doing wrong. You shouldn't beat them as hard as the slaves who did wrong that you knew were doing wrong. You don't hear that being taught very much in Sunday school class.
Well, of course, hell, eternal torture and torment for all the people who are murdered who don't happen to believe in him is a New Testament invention.
And or at least it popularized it. I think that's the very worst thing about the New Testament, is this idea of hell, and that you can be tormented just because you don't believe what someone else believes. And our commercial by Ron Reagan remains so controversial because he had the temerity to say, unabashed atheist, not afraid of burning in hell. And it's considered blasphemous.
Yeah, I'm not afraid of your myth is blasphemy.
Yeah, except that there's the religious idea that without the threat of eternal punishment, we don't have any incentive to be good people. We have to be scared in order to be good. Otherwise, we may as well do what we want. We can just live free without any moral restrictions. So hell is a big part of evangelical Christian teaching.
So we have an anonymous commenter who said that if God was truly kicked out of the schools, and that's what caused all this violence, then their God doesn't seem very powerful, does he? Part of that, though, is that they would say, well, he is powerful, he's choosing not to save these children, which I think is even worse.
Yes, even more immoral.
Yeah. So we have another question from Elizabeth S., who says, what if the thoughts and prayers are against what God wants? The God of the Bible doesn't mind killing humans, like during Noah's flood, Do they ever consider that if God, if he's real, doesn't care about their prayers?
And that is the whole basis of a very beautiful poem that you set to music, Dan, by Philip Appelman.
Yeah,
I think God never apologizes, never explains.
Don't you have a whole chapter in your book about it?
Yeah. Well, and then, of course, there's a contradiction, because the Lord's Prayer that Jesus supposedly gave says, "Thy will be done." So remember George Carlin had that really funny line about, well, then who are we to tell God, hey, you're going to do you since the beginning of the universe, you have your will and your divine plan, but now here we come along, any schmuck with a $2 prayer book, and ask God to change his mind. And not, so the Bible itself is contradictory, because it says, on one hand, whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer believing, you shall receive. If you do this, this will happen. But on the other hand, it says, thy will be done. And so there's no way to test, there's no way to prove, there's no way to know if the prayer is working or not, because if it doesn't work, well, it was God's will. So it's ineffective.
Yes, so we haven't really touched on the whole intellectual bankruptcy of the idea of prayer. That, thoughts, wishful thinking cannot change things. It cannot suspend the natural laws of the universe. Or, prevent somebody somewhere else from being crazy and shooting up a school.
Hitchens had a great line about it that I'm going to butcher a little bit, but he said, prayer is or actually maybe it wasn't Hitchens. Prayer is the belief that there's an omnipotent God who's ordered the universe a certain way, but that you know a better way to do it.
Yeah.
Right. There's a lot of hubris there from so-called humbled citizens.
Okay, but don't you think most people, when they say our thoughts and prayers, they're not really thinking about prayer as some tool of change. They're just saying, I'm thinking about you, I care about you, I don't know what else I can do, so like when you send a sympathy card to somebody, you're not really doing anything except letting them know that they're in your thoughts, kind of.
Right, and that's exactly why the students are so angry, Dan. Because they are, because these thoughts and prayers are mindlessly uttered by the very people who have all the power to protect those students and to do something about it. Yeah. So it is supremely contemptuous.
Yeah, they don't want cards from Marco Rubio. They want to. So this one's for you, Dan. James Selinsky says that I saw an editorial from the Christian Post today. As a former pastor, Dan, what do you think Jesus would say about guns? Would he be pro-life but also pro-guns? Maybe we should also, I'll tack on, is Jesus actually pro-life according to the Bible?
And I don't like that term pro-life as it applies to abortion.
Yeah, well, Jesus, among everything else Jesus said, he said, I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. He never once criticized the brutal, genocidal, infanticidal, and pestilential being that was his Father. He bragged about being the same as him. And all we have to do is look at the actions and deeds of that God of the Old Testament, whom Jesus praised and quoted liberally, to see that human life really has no value. The so-called love of the Bible is not a horizontal love and respect for people. It's a top-down abusive husband who says to his wife, you love me, and if you look at any other man, these are the horrible curses that are going to come upon you. So I think in that context we can say that Jesus was not pro-life, because life was cheap all through the Bible. The New Testament is a little calmer, a little more peaceful on average, but I think we can say that he would not be so in favor of protecting human life like we human beings think somebody should be.
So we have one more question from Benjamin Rockwell. He asks, but is prayer actually harmful?
Well, yes, I think it can be. And obviously we're seeing politically that it is harmful. For years and years, with all these school shootings, starting with Columbine at least, we've heard public officials trot out thoughts and prayers, I'm thinking of you, like they're doing something. And it's that idea that they can pat themselves on the back, that they have done something by praying or by saying that they're praying, that is so harmful. And it's this hypocrisy that we're starting to see this great uprising. The students and others, media, will not pretend along with the politicians that prayer means a damn thing.
Well, it is harmful if it stops you from doing something useful. Like Rita Swan's story, the Christian Science mother, whose child was ill from easily treatable meningitis.
Well, not easily, but at least
He
it would
would
have been
he would
treatable.
have survived. And instead, they brought in the practitioners to pray. And then the young girl up in Carol Newman up in northern Wisconsin, who died a horrible death.
That was a preventable death from diabetes.
Treatable diabetes on Easter morning, because the Bible says very clearly, "Is any sick among you? Let them call the elders of the church, anoint their head with oil, and pray for them, and the prayer of faith will heal the sick." So the people took that verse that promotes prayer, they took it literally, and they prayed for their daughter, and she died. So in that case, prayer, neglecting real help, medical help, was dangerous, and it caused the death. That young girl would be in college now probably, and might have thought for herself. She might have become a free thinker.
Yeah, she languished for months. I mean, this wasn't just a thoughtful parent missing cues. She was starving. She couldn't even get up off the couch. They knew how ill she was from diabetes.
So her death is directly attributable to active praying.
So those are the very bad sides of prayer. And I would say, of course, we would all agree that if somebody's religious and they find self-comfort from prayer, it's kind of could be like meditation, could be like going over rhymes or poems or songs if you're not religious, that is self-comforting in a time of stress. Then we don't care. I mean, people can believe what they like, but it's prayer as public policy that we object to.
I think so. I think you can make a little bit of an argument too that the thoughts and prayers in and of themselves can be problematic. When I think back when you hear the news of Parkland and you hear that 17 people are murdered, most of them children, your heart breaks for these families. You feel this deep and powerful empathy. You want to do something, anything, to help them out. And if that empathy is what makes us human, but if you pray that empathy away, you're praying away the motivation to actually do something. You're overcoming our humanity with whispers to a God that does not exist. And yeah, it might make you feel better, but if you assuage that motivation and are no longer going to do anything else, then I think it can be problematic.
When that thought and prayer comes from Marco Rubio or our president, people in positions, it really is a total ripoff of their job. It's just nothing. And then they are wrapping themselves in piety, like, aren't they wonderful? So in this instance, we can see the harm of the idea of prayer meaning something, or prayer and public policy. Things can't go on like this, and yet they will, unless people make change.
Yeah, I mean, prayers, they have no measurable impact. And I mean, imagine if all those people that said they were praying for all these mass shootings, instead for every one of the prayers they said donated $1 or even $0.25 to a nonprofit that was dedicated towards preventing gun violence in the future. Where would we be? So don't pray, do.
Well, and there was an article in the paper today by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times saying the members of Congress have a salary of $174,000 a year, and they get free parking at, did you know this? At the D.C. airport, Ronald Reagan Airport, DCA, and they don't want to give it up. All they want to do is keep their jobs, and they're getting all that money from the NRA, and also that threat of, we'll go after you if you don't vote right.
That's what it is.
And I mean, that's the reality here, and I think these high schoolers are not going to put up with it.
So we have one more question from Jay Feibach. Sorry, I think I butchered that one. I just saw a Friendly Atheist blog that said a Pennsylvania church near an elementary school will bless your assault rifles next week. What do you think about that?
Well, if true, that's just pathetic.
Tone deaf?
Tone deaf, yeah, and there actually were some auctions of assault weapons going on that they're under fire now. Some fire departments, not timed for, of course, what happened last week. But why would we can make a lot of money by auctioning off an assault weapon. So our country has to change its values. We're way too religious and way too interested in assault weapons.
Well, because they're imagining this weird scenario where children will be in school or teachers with assault weapons, and some attacker comes in, they'll be ready to defend themselves. They're viewing the gun as a defense thing, when really those guns are designed specifically to kill living creatures. That's what they're designed for.
Well, one after another.
Well, yeah, especially with the repeated. But sometimes we hear the argument, well, automobiles kill people, right? So automobiles are, but of course we do regulate automobiles, but automobiles were not designed as killing machines. They happen to, you can have accidents, right? But these guns were designed as machines to kill living things.
So that's all our questions.
Well,
We had a long conversation with
Yeah.
Billy Graham. There's actually an op-ed in The Guardian about Billy Graham that told me something new too. That was Billy Graham the day after Martin Luther King wrote the letter to the Birmingham jail. He said that whoa, we should all slow down and take a deep breath and back up. And the letter to the Birmingham jail was written to the white ministers, and in it, Martin Luther King has one of my favorite lines ever, which is it describes thoughts and prayers perfectly, which is, these people stand on the sidelines and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities while he was doing the business of fighting. And now we see these kids doing the business of fighting. So
He also pointed out that Sunday morning is probably the most segregated time of the week, especially during those years he was writing, because white churches, black churches, and Billy Graham was part of that whole segregation movement early in his life.
So that'll do it for
well,
us.
yes, we won't leave you with any prayers, and it's a very distressful time in our country. But one good thing has happened, in that we seem to be seeing people waking up to the ineffectuality of prayer as an answer to gun violence or other social problems.
It feels different this time.
And you know what else is kind of exciting is this younger generation. What do they call Generation Z or whatever? They seem to be engaged, skeptical, placing human values above and beyond everything else. So it'll be nice to see what happens in the future when this generation comes along.
And we can end on that happy note, because there was just a study done that said 21% of Generation Z are atheists and agnostics.
Explicitly,
Not non-religious.
yeah. I mean, and then
atheists or agnostics.
there's all the others who are non-religious.
Yeah.
But yes, that's really a big growth.
It's a huge chunk. So join us next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist, where we'll have another hopefully fun and enjoyable and fascinating conversation.
Hopefully a less grim topic.
Less grim topic for sure.
Freedom!